Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Productions. I'm Crowngrow's Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be continuing with our Disney series. In today's video we're going to be looking at none other than Pete's Dragon from 1977. So if you like what you've seen already, don't forget obviously hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified, and also don't forget to check out our many other videos in this playlist. I promise that you will not be disappointed. And also don't forget to check out our last two videos, which we're looking at the biographies of Wolfgang Reifman and Don Bluth. So this is going to be the first time in a while that we've been doing videos looking at films, so we're back to this now, and so we're not going to be doing the biography thing for a while now. But, of course, we have to give a massive shout out to the people who left a comment in the last video. So we have to give a shout out to Forrest Dupree, M. Barr, and to Julius Caesar Official. So, massive shout out to all of you guys, and if you want a shout out in the next video, don't forget to obviously leave a comment in the comment section. And now, without further ado, actually, you know what? Because we haven't done this for a little while, I'm going to remind people of how we have these videos set up. So we have, first of all, the story of the story of the creator, the story of the studio, the themes and the history, the legacy, and any notable lines and notable effects within the film. So, without further ado, we're going to dive straight now into the story of the story, so buckle up and let's go for the ride. So our story starts out with Pete, and he's walking through a forest by himself, and he's talking to himself for some reason. And he's on the run from a family of rednecks called the Gogans, and they are out looking for him because they paid $50.50 for him. But of course, they end up getting smacked up by an invisible tail, and they all end up rolling in the mud. Now the next day, Elliot the Dragon finally reveals himself to us, and this is where they end up singing a really nice song, before Pete tells him that he has become invisible again, which allows Elliot to go through the town of Masakudi Modi. I don't know how to say it, right? They say it in the film, but like even they struggle to say it. But he ends up going through the entire town and basically trashing it because of his clumsiness. So as Pete and Elliot are hiding, this is when Lampy, the drunken lighthouse keeper, ends up seeing him. And this is where, of course, no one ends up believing him because he's come to the town drunk, including his daughter Nora. So later on, as she's taking him back to the house, Nora sees Pete down in a cave by the coast. So she takes him into the lighthouse out of sympathy for the fact of him being an orphan, where she reveals that her fiancé Paul was lost at sea a year ago, so Pete promises to ask Elliot to find Paul. Next day we meet Dr. Terminus and his assistant Hoagie, and this is where they win over the townsfolk by basically tricking them. So Lampy goes to them to try and get them to convince the townfolk that there's indeed a dragon, but only Hoagie comes along, and this is where they go into the cave and get the dragon drunk, but still nobody believes them. So the next morning, the fishermen are complaining that there's no fish, and they blame Pete for bringing bad luck to them. But this is where Nora and Pete sing a song about how there's room for everybody, even a dragon. Now when he's at school, Pete gets beaten by the teacher for Elliot's mistakes, but Elliot gets mad at his friend for getting beaten up, so he mashes up the entire school, which causes the folks in the town to finally believe, which of course excites Dr. Terminus, as he and Hoagie get to slice him up for a quick buck. However, Pete refuses to sell, so they go off to sing yet another song, before we go and see the Gogans who come back, and they are demanding that they get Pete back because obviously they've paid for him. But Nora ends up refusing, and Elliot swims through the water and trashes their boat. Now Dr. Terminus ends up allying himself with the Gogans and with the fishermen in order to catch Elliot, so when Pete comes through, they take him hostage and send Hoagie to lure in Elliot, where they end up trapping him. But of course, Elliot breaks free, he saves Pete, he scares off the Gogans, and he saves the entire town. So now, Paul is finally back with Nora, but Elliot must fly on to help the next child. And so, this is where the film ends, and it ends happily ever after. So, that is the story of the story. But now we have to dive into the story of the creative process that went into the making of the film. So the story is based on an unpublished short story by Seton I. Miller and S.S. Field called Pete's Dragon and the USA, and they sold it to Walt Disney in 1957. Now originally Walt had wanted Kevin Corcoran to be the child actor for this, who's also in Old Yeller, so definitely stay tuned for that video. But he decided that it fitted much better for his Disneyland anthology program, with plans to make this a 2-part episode the following year. So even though filming was already scheduled and they already had the first draft of the script, Walt Disney was still quite unsure about this, and so he put the film in turnaround, which in layman's terms basically means he put the film on ice. Fast forward now a decade, so this is 1968, and so Walt Disney had obviously died the year before, and this now was finally the time when you had 2 writers who came forward and they started to try and write a script for this film. So this is now the second script for Pete's Dragon. So although the writers presented the idea to the studios, it was decided once again that it was going to be put in limbo, until 1975 when producer Jerome Cortland ended up rediscovering the project and he hired Malcolm Morgenstern to rewrite the script. So Morgenstern is the one who's changed the setting of it from being a contemporary one to being a period setting. And he also is the one who decided that Elliot should be a real dragon instead of an imaginary one. So within the studios, there ended up being a huge debate raging about just how visible Elliot should be, until Ken Anderson lobbied for him to be mainly visible throughout the story. And this was because he argued that the audience would lose patience if he was only visible for a limited amount of time, which Malcolm later ended up conceding and said that actually, you know what, this is meant to be a film for the kids, and actually if the kids can't see Elliot for most of it, then it's not actually going to be that useful. And also we should note that Elliot was named after Elliot Gould, who's an old friend of Malcolm Morgenstern, and we should also note that the town was named after a real Native American tribe that lived in Maine, and this was of course
I know.
Now that covers the story of the creative process, but now we have to talk about the story of the studio. So the music was done by Al Kasher and Joel Herschel, and it was directed by Don Chaffee. So he's the same person who directed Jason and the Argonauts and also 1 Million Year BC. So he had experience of things being animated and also special effects within the films. Also as well, we should note that the animators made a purposeful decision that Elliot should actually be a more westernized dragon. The reason being is because in the West, dragons are seen as basically scary animals, whereas in Eastern mythology, they are seen as more friendly. And so basically a lot of the drama and a lot of the kind of conflict within this story mainly comes from the fact of people thinking that Elliot is the scary dragon. So again, if it was more Eastern, it wouldn't have necessarily had the same effect. Also as well, we should say that this was the very first film in which none of Disney's 9 old men did any part of the animation. So many of them had died by this time or else had retired. And so this film here, the animation was predominantly done by Don Bluth, so he was the animating director. Again, we covered him more in our last video. Definitely check out the biography of Don Bluth. And also we should say finally with regard to the animation that Ken Anderson, he is the reason why Elliot is very clumsy within this. And again, this is for comedic effect, and obviously it helps to pad out the runtime quite a bit, but also is quite central within the story as the reason why many of the townsfolk are hostile towards Pete, and then later when they find out it's Elliot, they're also quite hostile to Elliot. And we should also say with regard to Elliot being animated, that there were 3 layers of animation for this. So much in the same way as you had for Mary Poppins, you'd basically have, say for instance, you have Pete, then you have Elliot, then you have the background. So the 3 layers of the images would be put over each other, and this is how they were able to actually animate the film. Now talking about the casting for the film, so you have Helen Reddy, who is the one who plays Nora, and she, outside of the world of film, was mainly known as a singer. Next you have Jim Dale, who's the person who plays Dr. Terminus, and he was most known in many of the Carry On films. Next you have Mickey Rooney, who is the person who plays Lampy, and he is best known for his part in It's a Mad, Mad, Mad World. Next you had Red Buttons, who is the person who plays Hoagie, and he was just quite a minor actor. And next we should say that Lena, who is the mother of the Gogan family, she is played by Shelley Winters, so she is best known in the film Lolita, and also in Alfie and many other films, in particular within the 1960s. And then also we should say that Pete is played by Sean Marshall, and also we should say that one of the Gogan boys was played by Jeff Conaway. So he is one of the people who's in Greece, so that's probably where he's best known in. Although the fact that he's wearing so much makeup in this would mean that it's probably quite hard for one to recognise him. And then finally, we should say that the voice of Elliot is done by Charlie Callis. So he was a comedian, and he was most known for working with Jerry Lewis and with Dean Martin back in the 1950s. So that covers the casting of the film. And now we have to talk about the themes and the history. So, of course, first of all, the major theme of this is one which recurs many times within Disney films, and this is to do with, basically the main stars not being believed. So whether it's children or whether it's animals, etc., the main thing in this is a thing of not being believed. So even Nora, who's obviously quite close to him, it's not till the very, very end that she finally ends up seeing with her own eyes, and that's when she actually believes in Elliot. But none of them just believe on the face of it, even though Pete is obviously in the right. And also as well, we should say that there's the theme of greed, which is shown many, many times. So whether this is Dr. Terminus and Hoagie, who are just focused on money, money, money by the pound, or whether it's the Gogan family, who don't talk about how they missed the boy, etc. It's just the fact of, they spent $50 on him plus legal fees. And this is a line which is said repeatedly throughout this. And actually, in both cases of, Dr. Terminus and Hoagie, and also for the Gogan family, they make songs about how much they care about money. And also as well, we should say, this film here is very typical of films from the 1970s onwards, and this is because it's very inclusive. So first of all, as well, you can see with many of the actors in this, they're obviously African American, and although this is set in New England, they have black people in it and stuff, which is, if this film was done maybe a decade or two before, they just wouldn't have had people in there like that. And also as well, we should say, actually, before I kind of get onto that, why is it that the Gogan family are rednecks? Like, they have southern accents, even though it's meant to be in New England. That's just something which I have to kind of say doesn't make much sense. But anyway, right, in terms of tolerance and inclusion, it's also is a thing where basically, if you look at the song to do with there's room for everyone in this world, that there is very kind of hippie-ish kind of song. It's a very kind of, let's everyone all hold hands. And again, if this film came out in 1957, as was originally planned, would this song have actually featured in that? Probably not. Because at that time, obviously, America was very divided over the issue of segregation and was not very inclusive at all. But by 1977, the society had moved significantly towards that. So even though they're just talking about a dragon in this, actually the message of there's room for everyone in this world, it kind of is very much in keeping with the times. And of course, this had an impact on the legacy of the film because it seems to have done very, very well at the box office. So it had a budget of just $10 million, but at the box office, it made 18 million. And 16.1 million of that came from domestic audiences in US and Canada. However, in terms of the legacy of the film, in terms of its longevity, it has had a lifetime domestic gross of between $36 and $39.6 million within just the US and Canada alone. So what one tends to find with certain films is that, most of the revenue that they have comes just from the box office alone, and then afterwards there's not much longevity. However, for this film, it's seen that, you can clearly see that many, many people have continually watched the film long after it was released. And actually, in 2016, they did a remake of the film, which I haven't seen just yet. But again, they don't tend to do remakes for things unless it kind of was good in the first place. So that is something clearly to note with that its legacy is very, very long lasting. Although it should also be noted that the Disney studios, they had actually wanted this to be a blockbuster. It's very similar to how you had for Mary Poppins. So if you're comparing it to Mary Poppins, was it that great of a film? Not really. It didn't do as well as Mary Poppins did, of course. But still, I think it's really good. I actually hadn't seen the film since I was a little kid. And so watching it twice over the last few days has actually been very, very interesting for me. And again, I've noticed many things which one doesn't tend to notice as a child. But now, finally, we have to talk about the notable lines and the notable effects within this. So we've already covered about the notable effects. However, we should kind of say that in terms of the animation, it literally is just Pete. There's no other things within that. Also as well, we should kind of say that oftentimes this technique doesn't come across as smooth as it does in Mary Poppins, for instance. And also as well, we should say that the acting of Pete is not always the best in terms of where it lines up with imaginary, that there's an imaginary dragon there. So, you know, it's good, but at the same time, it's not perfect. But still, nonetheless, we need to talk about the notable lines. So the film had many notable lines. So first of all, we're going to go through this.
I took your drugs for losing weight, and now I'm a blob. But now that there's so much more of you to love.
And then we're going to go through this.
There ain't no room in this town for a dragon. And there ain't no room in this town for jinxes like you, neither.
Well, if there's enough room for a chowderhead like you, then there's more than enough room for a dragon.
And then we're going to go through this.
Can't you hear that jingle jangle song? Oh yeah! It's money, money, money by the pound.
And then we'll take a look at this.
Up and down.
That's right.
Up and down. This is fun.
Well, if it's so much fun, I'm going to leave it to you and Nora to finish up.
And finally, we'll have a look at this.
I've known you, Alan Beast, since you were nothing. But now, Hokey, now, you're still nothing.
So as you can see, the film obviously was very good. If you haven't seen it already, I would highly recommend that you go and watch it. But regardless whether you liked it or not, you can always hit a like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified, and also don't forget 2 things. First of all, to leave a comment in this video so that you get a shout out in the next one. And also stay tuned for our next video, which is going to be on Old Yeller. Right, so I was going to do Fox and the Hound. However, through doing the research for this, I remembered, oh snap, Old Yeller was a Disney film as well. So we're going to go back in time to 1957, and that's when we're going to be looking at Old Yeller. But still, in the meantime, have a great day, and bye.